morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Thank you for that applause and welcome. I want to acknowledge President Harous, Provost Sanders, the OUHSC administrators, college deans, city and state elected officials, the OKC Baptist Minister Association, the OKC NPHC, students of OUHSC, Andrea Latson Chambers, and to all of you. That should have covered everybody. That's called protocol, getting it out of the way. And I want to thank the African American Student Association for inviting me to be here with you on today. And I want to thank you for continuing to celebrate, commemorate, remember, and activate my father's legacy here in Oklahoma. As I stand here, I stand not just in commemoration of my father, but I also stand in honor of my mother, Coretta Scott King. Everywhere I go, I remind people that but for Coretta Scott King, we probably would not be commemorating Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. For you see, when he was assassinated in 1968, he was one of the most hated men in America. He had raised his voice by that time against a war that was raging in Vietnam, that this nation later acknowledged was a horrible mistake. And also because he challenged this nation to not just live up to its ideals, but to invest in those ideals. That instead of flooding money into a militaristic system to fight wars abroad, that we needed to fight the wars that we were faced here, right here in America. In particular, at that time, the supposed war on poverty. We did not listen. And so today, some 52 years after his assassination, we are still contending with the issue of poverty. It is perhaps worse than it was in 1968. And so because he spoke out against that war, he addressed how we were distributing wealth in this nation. He was taken away from us by an assassin's bullet. Many people turned against him when he spoke out against that war. Many spoke out against him, including many of his colleagues in civil rights, because they cautioned him that if he did speak out, that it would threaten the support of the current presidential administration for civil rights. And because they had made had made so much progress in that area, they wanted to ensure that that progress would not stop. But if you study Martin Luther King Jr., you will discover that he was a man of deep conscience. He was driven by his conscience. And I'm afraid as we look at this world today, we are lacking that level of consciousness in America and the world. And so while he was one of the most hated in '68, he's one of the most loved in the world today. And that's because every day of her life, not just during the time of the movement, because my mother was an activist in her own right. Even before she met my father, she was involved in the peace movement and actually encouraged him to speak out against the war in Vietnam. But because she devoted all of her life to institutionalizing his work and his legacy, she traveled all around the world so that people would know that there was more to the movement than what people observed on film. Most people, when they think about the civil rights movement, they think about the demonstrations. They think about the protest. They think about the sit-ins, and they think about the marches across bridges like the Edmund Pettus Bridge. But what people still to this day do not fully grasp and understand is the philosophy and the methodology that was involved in bringing about those changes in our nation. And so the work that I do every day is to continue that, is to expose, educate, and train people in my father's philosophy and methodology of nonviolence that we believe is the most effective means for bringing about true social change and transformation. And so as I stand here today, I want to briefly look at the notion of justice and how you approach it from a Kingian way. I want you to hear this. 1967, and probably even before that time, because many times my father utilized words over and over again in different speeches. But he said this: love and power have been contrasted as polar opposites. So love is often identified with a resignation of power, and power as a denial of love. He went on to say, what is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive. And love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power or love correcting everything that stands against love. Justice at its best is power/love correcting everything that stands against love. This definition of justice reminds us that that it's not revenge, it's not retribution, and it's not retaliation. My dad's definition gets us back to the root of injustice, a lack of love, and a quest for power in and of itself. Our essential fallacy in this nation, and I would say world, is we've turned against love and instead opted for power. It shows in our systems, our policies, our relationships, our biases, our rhetoric, our media, our entertainment, our social media, our art. In every sector of our lives, it shows. And so Dr. King beckons us to come to this place where if we're going to have a just, humane, and peaceful world, then we are going to have to understand that our motive must be to bring together love and power so that we can see social transformation. So true justice is an alignment and an interplay between love and power to bring about social transformation. In the absence of that, especially as we look at this nation and the levers of power, we end up with things like health disparities. These disparities run the gamut. In every area of American life, there are grave racial disparities. But the question becomes, how do we correct it? What do we do about it? Because one thing that we're excellent at in this country now, finally, is speaking up. That deserves an applause. More and more people are letting their voices be heard in these United States. And that is wonderful. Because the reason I believe we have not made the kind of progress that we should have made between 1968 and now is because too many people remain silent. And as Daddy reminded us, our life begins to end the day we remain silent about the things that matter. And now we have a nation that matters. It matters because the next generation is raising their voices. It matters because people from all walks of life are raising their voices. But raising our voices is not enough. Demonstrating and protesting is not enough. It's important that in order to correct something, you go back to the root of that thing. And one of the things we fail to do in addressing justice in this country is we failed to go back to the beginning and look at how this country was structured and set up from the very beginning. There was almost a 400-year time period where this nation was based on race. So let me say it like this. From the founding of this nation, you could not even become a naturalized citizen unless you were white. That's important for us to know. For 246 years, which is about 62% of our time now, we were under chattel slavery. But at that same time, it was not just slavery happening. There was a nation being developed. There were systems being put in place. And those systems were based off of this notion of whiteness being first. I don't want you to get quiet on me. Because in the health arena, you know, if you don't get to the root of a cause, you can't cure it and you can't correct it. So there was this structural advantage that was given to people who were white. But there was a time period when whiteness was not even an issue. During that time period, it was a bit more about the elite and those who were not elite. But then those that were what we call today the 99%, back then the 99% who came together, and because of the power of their alliance, there had to emerge a system to begin to break people up and separate and divide people. And since that time, there has been this notion of divide and conquer and this false premise around whiteness. This is important because no matter how much we do today to try to address racial disparities, other disparities, if we don't go back in time and look at the system that we set up and then analyze how is it that we can redo the system, then all we're going to do is to create new structures of racism. Let me give you an example. As we know, we live in a very technologically driven society. It is now proven that some of our algorithms are showing disparity. In other words, racism is now seeping into our new technological structures. And the only way we're going to revert this is for us to acknowledge the truth of who we've been as a nation, that there's always been this invisible notion that if you're white, especially heterosexual male, then you are superior to everyone else in this nation. We don't talk about it, but our systems reflect it. Look in our boardrooms across the world, nation. Look in most of our C-suites across the nation. Something is fundamentally wrong because even though we have now launched all of these diversity and inclusion initiatives, it seems as if nothing has really changed. In fact, there was a person who once said that there's been a lot of progress, but not much has changed. Not much has changed in terms of the systems and structures. So today, our greatest challenge is how do we address systemic and institutionalized racism that actually can be enforced by people of color? Because it's a sick system. It's a structure, their policies and their practices and their behaviors. And subconsciously, most of us are perpetuating these things because we have yet to acknowledge the truth of the fact that our country, although had a history of racism, that racism is now embedded in our systems and structures. John first starts with recognizing what our ultimate goal is. What kind of world do we really want? Dr. King challenged us to this world where we manifest what he popularized as the beloved community, which is achievable. It's a realistic goal, as my mother said. It's not a utopia. It's not a place where it has an absence of conflict, but it's a place where people can join together collectively and work together collectively to ensure that everyone is valued as a human being and that every person is treated with dignity and justice. In that beloved community, you don't cancel people who disagree with you. But what you do is you operate and be driven by that love proposition that Daddy talked about and stand in the strength and the courage to challenge those things that stand against that love. And so if there's a person who has hate, you don't just push them out, because the further you push out a person of hate, the more they're going to align with others just like that. And so the goal in the beloved community is to win people over, not win over people. And so as we approach how we correct things, we have to keep our mind on the goal of creating that beloved community and recognize that what we are challenging are isms, what we are challenging are issues, what we are challenging is injustice. We are not challenging people. Unfortunately, in today's climate, there is a lot of conflict going on between people, and we're charging each other, and we are attacking each other with the words from our mouth, and it's not getting us anywhere. Because you cannot bring true social transformation by keeping your attention on people. You have to keep your focus on the injustice. In the nonviolence approach that we teach that nonviolence seeks to destroy injustice, not people. That's why you have to have the right heart and spirit. You have to have that love and the power that you are exercising when you raise your voice. You cannot denigrate people. You cannot put people down. You cannot attack their character, because the point in which you do that, you undermine your ultimate effort. If you ever look at the videos of those who ended up having to protest during the movement, there was this manner in which they carried themselves. You did not sense any hate and bitterness and rage coming out of them. They had an extreme level of discipline and dignity with the way in which they challenged injustice. And it doesn't matter. People say, well, it's just bad today, so, people are not going to pay attention to you, unless you get indignant and you cuss them out and you use some violence. That's the only way we're going to get attention. But what kind of attention? What will be the outcome in the end? Will it render a true change, or will it render a temporary change? And so that ultimate goal has to always be in mind when you approach issues of injustice and disparities. The other requirement that is lacking in today's society is framing the issue. There's a lot going on in our climate. There are a lot of things to be concerned about. There are a lot of issues that we are faced with as a humanity. And the reality is that if there is not clarity when it's time to address an injustice, then there will be a lot of confusion and people will be running in all kinds of directions. And so you have to frame the issue. You have to ask critical questions, such as what I did at the beginning. How did we get here? I was talking to a person recently, and they were telling me that they were in a conversation with a group of people, and one of the persons in the group said there really isn't a race problem. That there's just, people that are pushing that and driving that. I mean, there's no racism in this country. There are not a lot of mean-spirited people. And then they went on to say that why is it that there's this notion that white people need to do more? I mean, black people need to do more. The subtlety is that black people would only do what they need to do to lift up their community, then we wouldn't have these problems. In other words, the reason the black community has these disparities is because of choices that they're making. Whoa. We have done a disservice because we're upset, we're angry, and understandably so, about the outcomes, about the injustices, about what appears to be evil. And because of that, we have not been able to articulate the issues in a manner that people can fully understand. Because sometimes our emotions can get in the way. And that's why we have to frame the issues. That's why we have to do the critical analysis and asking the what, the how, the when. And we have to be willing in the framing of that issue to educate people. We can't make certain presuppositions. In today's world, we use a lot of words. We make a lot of statements, and we indicate a lot of things, and we assume that people know or should know because they're intelligent people. And we have an internet, and you can Google anything you want to Google. But to me, that's short-sighted. Because if you're committed to the ultimate goal of creating this beloved community and fighting against those injustices that are undermining our community as a whole, then you have to have a willingness and a commitment for the long haul to bring people up, to open their eyes. Because when people live in an insulated environment, until something jolts them, they're not going to come out of that environment. That's going to be their everyday reality. And so, thank God my father saw that it was important to fight against segregation, to open us up so that we could come together to begin that process. Because he said, people, and he used the word men, so I'm going to do it in this context, so please don't get offended by that. But he said, men hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other. They don't know each other because they don't communicate with each other. And they don't communicate with each other because they are separate from each other. As long as people remain separated and segregated and in these insulated environments, they are going to continue down that pathway of what he also said is dangerous, which is sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. So we have a responsibility when you are, this is another thing we don't deal with, when you are privileged to know. Because privilege is not just white privilege, there's class privilege. In the black community, there's light skin privilege. You know, there's religious privilege. If you're Christian and you're not, you know, Muslim or Jew or Hindu or other religions. I mean, privilege varies. But there also is a privilege of being enlightened. There's a privilege of being a child of light. That we have a responsibility to those in the dark. I always tell people that it is irresponsible to leave people in their ignorance, in their fear, in their anger, in their stupidity. We have a responsibility to open up their eyes. So framing the issue is very important because there are a lot of voices. There are a lot of detractors. That's why we had the problem when Colin knelt in the NFL, because every voice started speaking and there was not a voice, there was not a force of voices making sure that the issue was clear. It was not about the flag. It never was about the flag. But when you don't frame an issue right, then other people will run with another narrative. They'll change the subject. They'll get off track. So even as you're addressing certain issues in your workplaces, in your communities, always come back to, okay, what is the issue? Let's frame it. Let's ask some critical questions. Let's come to an agreement on what the issue is so that when we have something that may come in to take us off track or to divide us as a community, we can come back to this. And that's what was brilliant about my father's leadership. He was able to articulate the issue and keep people's attention on what the issue was so they didn't get off track and they stayed focused and on a higher plane. And that has to happen in today's society. And then last but not least, which is where the rubber really meets the road. If we're going to stand against everything that stands against love, then we have to organize what my daddy called organizing our strength into compelling power. In his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos of Community, that he released in 1967. And by the way, if you have not done so, I would advise that you read the books that he wrote instead of the books written about him, because you need to hear it in his context. And then you can go to the secondary sources. And he was a gifted writer, not just orator, but he was a gifted writer. He talked about where we're going in a chapter, and he said, the nettlesome task going forth. And it's nettlesome. It's not easy. It can be bothersome, irritating. It's like, do we have to go through all of this? Yes, we do. The nettlesome task is to organize our strength into compelling power. One of the tragedies of today's justice movements is that there's a lot of disorganization. Does it amaze you that it seems like the forces of darkness and injustice are making more headway than the people of goodwill and people who are on the side of true justice? That puzzles me. It disturbs me. I heard somebody recently say that their pastor went to a conference and came back and said, an organized lie is more powerful than a disorganized truth. And so we have to expend energy and time looking at those areas that we are passionate in, that we have strengths in. And then we have to align them to work together in collaboration, in cooperation, to address disparities, to address injustices, inequities in our society. And that requires an assessment of needs. What is needed to truly address health disparities? For instance, when my father and them were planning the Montgomery bus protests, it felt good to talk about boycotting buses. I mean, people talk about that, let's just boycott. And my question always is, okay, there are people that work for that company that could be your cousin, your distant cousin, that could be like you, that are concerned about justice. So when we go to boycott, have you thought about what if it gets to the place that that place is shut down or they have to lay people off? What is the plan to ensure that those people can get another job? So what they did is they decided, wait a minute, 97%, 99% of the citizens in Montgomery rely on that public transportation. So our goal at the time, as we were boycotting, was not to necessarily put the bus company out of business, because they were going to still need the buses. But in the meantime, since we feel that these people are not treating us with dignity and respect, then we're going to withdraw our economic support, but we're going to put another system in place so that these people can still get to work. So they had to look at the needs of that community to surround what they were doing to address the issue. So it's different things in different situations. There's no one set way of addressing issues of injustice. The needs are different in each situation. And so it requires the kind of organization that looks at that and then looks at the resources that you have before you and what are the resources that you need to win over. That's why in the struggle for justice, you always have to remember the ultimate goal, because you're not trying to piss people off. You're trying, again, to win people over, win allies to the cause, because the more people that are allied in the cause, the greater the force and the power of love to bring about that social transformation. And so organizing that strength, organizing it. The worst thing that we have done today is we've diluted our strength because there are too many different causes, too many different organizations and entities trying to address the same exact thing, instead of trying to figure out how do we organize all these different causes, all these different, organizations into a whole to effectively address whatever the injustice or the disparity is. Because you need as many people as possible. When you're coming up against these giants and you're talking about undoing systems, you've got to bring in as many allied groups and individuals as you can. And it needs to be that if this is my area of strength, I need to align with other people in that area of strength. And then we need to coordinate all these different areas into a whole so that we can effectively address it. That's what it means by organizing our strength into compelling power, because he said then they can't, whoever the they is, that you are making the demands on, the people who have the power. Because love with power, when it meets power, it can change power. It can cause power to be neutralized. Love is not enough, as I said earlier. Power alone becomes corrupted and destructive. But love and power has the ability to overwhelm power only. And many of these systems and structures of injustice that end up creating these disparities are based in power. And they need the collaboration and the connection of love and power organized to overwhelm it. That's how we're going to bring about a beloved community. Yes. And it's continual. Yes. For those who think that there is an arrival point, let me share this with you. There isn't. Coretta Scott King, I'm going to leave you with this. She said, struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and you win it in every generation. We want what's better for our kids. But folks, when we do everything within our power to make it better, there's still going to be something else that has to be done. That's why we have to be vigilant in every generation. Because the fact of the matter is, the world always has the presence of darkness. When it's dark, when it's light in Atlanta, it's dark somewhere else in the world. Light and darkness are here. And the only way, though, that we can rid ourselves of the darkness is that we have to operate in the framework of light. And that means the intersection of love and power, operating in courage to overwhelm the darkness, recognizing the importance of being vigilant and disproving something that my father said. Can you believe I want to do that? I do. Everything else that he said, for the most part, I'm there. I love it. But this thing, we must disprove. So one of the tragedies still, and he said that when he was living. So let's fast forward to 2020. One of the tragedies still of human history is that the children of darkness are often more zealous and determined than the children of light. My charge to you, walk in the light. Always be vigilant. Ensure that the motive of what you are doing to address injustice and disparities brings together both love and power. And when we do that together, we will see a more just, humane, and peaceful world. God bless you.